Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. Is Christianity a cult? I've done my best to explain why I sincerely believe the answer is yes. I was nervous to say it at first. Long before this podcast was conceived, I wrote a book to explain how churches control, contain, and convert. It wasn't a very academic book or well-researched, but I knew there was some truth there. I wanted to get the word out, so I started the Cult of Christianity podcast. And that decision changed my life. I've always known that we need words in our language that have negative connotations. I always meant cult as a slur of sorts, not in the spirit of dehumanizing victims of cult manipulation, but to keep the focus on the fact that abuse should not be tolerable, even in the context of a group. I do not like structures that benefit some at the cost of many. This has never been about groups sharing values or beliefs. It's not just a matter of rehashing the dangers of extremism or exclusivity, though it certainly is worth training the eye to see those things when it's not immediately obvious. This has never been about dismissing spirituality, ancient wisdom, or reducing religion as meaningless or inherently inhumane. I haven't denied any problematic behaviors of any group, religion, country, society, family, or couple. We all can propagate bad things at our worst. An organization is not inherently evil. In fact, Jesus' teachings weren't ever really my problem either, at least what we know about him, and our elementary interpretations of what his teachings might have been. He was likely a real and well-known person, but it's unlikely he performed any miracles or rose from the dead. But regardless, he made an impact. Such an impact that his existence changed the course of history forever. But the promise that following him leads to everlasting life has proven empty, if not by the fact that he hasn't returned, despite us suffering exponentially, then by the fact that the fruit of his followers in the modern day is more rotten than those who do not. And great quotes aside, Jesus might have been a cult leader when he lived, and whether he was or not when he lived, by proxy, he leads a flock determined to defeat their enemies and ascend to a better plane of existence than non-believers. And those progressive Christians that have tried to reimagine or indulge a heresy or two to make this all seem nicer are often admirable souls themselves, but they are losing the battle to evangelicals who are racist by their mere existence, bigots in their boasting, and patriarchal propagandists who cause violence, suffering, and societal collapse. Evangelicals, that group of Christians hyperfixated on the suffering and resurrection of Jesus, who believe that they have exchanged spiritual status with him and must share their gospel in order to continue fulfilling his mission, they have been the main target of both my deconstruction and analysis. Even as I've learned more and find Christians of all stripes to be problematic in some way, the evangelicals still scare me more than any other cult sect. and over 60 episodes of a wide range of topics explaining how this affects different people's individual lives, expanding how we think of these ideas culturally at large, and doing a compare and contrast between Christianity and more infamous cults, how they control, contain, and convert, where the distinction between cult leaders and followers lies. It's been a massive undertaking that has taken over 3 years to complete. I have exhaustively explained my opinion in over 500,000 words, over 15,000 minutes, and tried my best to remain consistent, focused, and open-minded. But more than simply propagating my own opinions or using my own deconstruction story to try to invalidate the testimonies of church folk, I have learned more. I haven't merely doubled down, per se. I've simply awakened to more information and more analyses. I have not become less convinced that Christianity is a cult, but more assured that cults are dangerous, and Christianity is indeed one of them. And here are the revelations of John. The revelations of this journey that I'm so glad I began on Easter 2021. In the first episode, I established some definitions, clearly stated what I was opposed to and why, and shared a lot of my story. Aside from now cringy references to Joe Rogan and Russell Brand, two figures who audibly assisted in opening my mind to other ideas, who are now poster boys for closed minds and alternate realities, I stand by so much of what I said, even as I see life a good bit different now than I did 3 years ago. If anything, I was a bit hesitant and lacked confidence in calling out the cult. And I don't blame 26-year-old me for being scared. I was scared. I was putting my reputation with my family at risk. I was expanding on a book that already offended a lot of the people I knew. I was being vulnerable in a new way, and you can hear it in my voice. I didn't know how my podcast would be received or even how to master audio quality or set up a project that I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea that this would be a life calling. I figured it might be a 10-episode experiment that I'd forget about the next year. And yet, all these years later, the pilot is still the most popular episode. And it's a weird thing to know that thousands of people have listened to me nervously stutter to explain myself. I broke it down by saying my definitions, giving my explanations of my religious trauma, explaining why I felt Christianity needs to be deconstructed, maybe even reconstructed. And I referenced history and culture, all just to build why I began to leave. And it's so funny to think that back then I was still uncomfortable saying I'm not a Christian. If there's a takeaway from that pilot, it's this. It's okay to speak before you are certain. It's okay to figure it out as you go. And I had a lot more wisdom back then than I sometimes give myself credit for. I was finding my voice. But deep down, I knew my voice was valuable. And that self-confidence was a bit of the fake it till you make it variety. But regardless, I am so proud of myself for that first episode. I had no idea it would lead to a career, to grad school, to any kind of recognition. And most importantly and surprisingly, it led to helping others find language for their experiences. I also didn't know that it would lead me to one of my best friends. And after speaking with her for only 20-ish minutes, I interviewed Lily about indoctrination, and we had sent memes and knew each other online kind of via my bestie Chris, but I had no idea that conversation would not only be personally validating, but the start of a connection that changed my life. I won't embarrass Lily by gushing about how much I love her now. Maybe I'll save that for the series finale. But I'll say one of the biggest values for the podcast was not just her perspective on various topics, as she ended up being the most frequent guest on the show, but even her counterbalance and different framings than I had. Because she doesn't necessarily identify as a cult survivor like I do, or see Christianity as clearly nefarious as I do, or at least not to the same degree. But she does agree that the trauma evangelicalism causes is not spoken about enough. And in our small, nuanced disagreements about particular words, me and her have overwhelmingly found a lot of unity in wanting freedom and autonomy for both kiddos and adults. And in speaking with her, both on air and off, I found a lot of wisdom, comfort, and energy in knowing that we did not leave one cult to join another. And I've also learned from her story and perspective that indoctrination doesn't just happen to Sunday morning warriors. She did not go to one church almost every day of her childhood like I, but rather experienced a lot of direct indoctrination from her mother. And it made me think in terms less stereotypical. And to see how indoctrination is not merely a fundamentalist issue or stylized the same way for everyone. Indoctrination happens through so many different methods, and the tentacles are hard to get a good handle on. In that episode, we talked about our hair and how that was one of the things we were that was controlled via Christian speak. We talked about subtleties and overtness. We talked about how trauma still affects us, but the biggest discovery that Lily and I made was that we are friends forever. And bonding after such tough experiences can be done healthily and can be so rewarding. The third episode was a monologue talking about prayers and rituals. And at the time, I had not decided on a clear structure for the podcast. I thought maybe it'd alternate between interviews and monologues. The next episode, I did a weird mix of both, but I was still finding not only my voice, but the voice of the podcast. But I was still thinking in terms of promoting my book and somewhat following the structure and topics I had covered in those pages. And if anything, I was thinking too small about my own work and ideas. But this is the episode where my listenership started growing. And I presented the idea of prayer not as a silly exercise, as some atheists make it sound. And don't get me wrong, it is a little silly in how it is typically practiced. But conceptually, I wanted to present a case for mindfulness over mindlessness. I also was thinking in much more pro-spiritual terms than I do now. But the thing I did emphasize, that I will continue to emphasize, is how rituals are used to manipulate people. And sometimes when deconstructing Christianity, we miss larger points by focusing on smaller ones. It's valuable to mention that praying to an all-knowing, all-powerful God isn't going to change his mind, or if it did, he ain't much of a God. But there's a deeper thing to examine there. Corporate prayer is used to measure people's correctness and conformity, while private prayer is used to keep indoctrinated doctrines as mantras, where the cult leaders aren't around, you still repeat their ideas. And I remember feeling like so much of what I said would be taken as hyperbole. In early episodes, I was sometimes timid and cautious, disclaiming left and right, not wanting to be misheard and desperately wanting to be taken seriously. But now with the confidence of going through this 3-year journey, I understand that I am sometimes listened to, whether I'm passionately ranting or exploring with a more nuanced tone. But I'm also dismissed either way. Sometimes I'm heard, sometimes I'm not. So now I speak with conviction. And when I put all these cult conspiracies out there with virtually zero rigorous pushback, I have gotten a lot of this stuff exactly correct from the beginning. And my point was Christian prayer is not being mindful. It's all about being manipulated. And that's the same with sermons. Janae, one of the folks I respect the most in my life, was gracious enough to support me, even as I left the faith that she loves so much. But she sees all the same problems I do and has just slightly different solutions. But the amount of sexism she faced trying to study preaching at Moody alongside me, it was insane. Not to even mention the racism. But the takeaway from that episode was not only that mixing monologue and interview was not the style I really wanted to do, but it also showed that I didn't need total agreement with my guest in order to create high quality content and ask probing questions. Because at the end of the day, sermons are pure propaganda. There really isn't a way around it. It's odd that I pursued preaching when I was already slightly skeptical of it. But so much of learning how to preach was motivated by how to preach the right things. I knew it was powerful, so I wanted to learn how to wield the power for the light side of the force. But I learned the power of speech when compromised by appeals to the authority of the Bible and the trappings of persuasion over substance is ultimately destructive and ruins lives. Beyond the pulpit, the office of pastor simply shouldn't exist. When I talk about trust issues with Ben in the next episode, he was one of the first podcast hosts to interview me. He vulnerably shared his church trauma, and it was a good exercise for me to listen more than speak in my interviews. I'm not sure what Ben's up to these days, but his gentleness and genuine ear for my story showed me that not only are some Christians potentially willing to engage with my ideas, but their disagreement is usually an appeal to their faith rather than countering my actual points. And broken trust within Christianity is standard, not an exception to the rule. It is the rule. The whole point of the cult is to break your trust in yourself, to distrust what you think the voice of God might be, and to only trust your cult leader. It's more than the preaching and the prayers. It's even in the music. And having Chris, my best friend, finally agree to come on to talk about manipulative music was a big step for both of us. We were both still coping with our exit from evangelicalism, but my memory is Chris was still going to church occasionally and was cautious about associating with something that's called the cult of Christianity. But he needed to. And I needed him. Because from the beginning, he helped me see nuances where I was blind early on and was also able to support my wonderings even where he disagreed. And it also solidified that I wanted him to be a series regular. He's got a great voice. And even when I first started talking about creating a podcast, I wanted him to either co-host or fact check, somehow have a role. But understandably so, his life was too busy, and he was also too unsure of where my work was going, as was I. But ultimately, I was scared to go on my own at this. But in some way, I needed to do this by myself. And talking about music with him was good for both of us, therapeutic in a way. Our deep love for music, both as composers and consumers, was so intertwined with our former cult that we had to grieve and redefine what our passion for music meant. And that alone shows that something sinister is going on with how Christians treat music. And further than that, it shows that there is nothing sacred to them apart from their dogma. And that dogma is always toxic. Probably one of the most infamous episodes of the Cult of Christianity was the patriarchy panel I had with my best friend Amelia, Lily, and Sierra. It was definitely a reductive and somewhat baby step version of Challenges to Feminism 101, but I was trying to explain that patriarchy isn't an imagined problem. Women aren't just scapegoating it for all their problems. I was also still building off an assumption that many Christians would still listen to the pod, and early on, many Christians did. I also wanted to show that good ideas hold up to scrutiny. So in that episode, I asked provocative and critical questions when viewing social developments like patriarchy. And all three women showed not only how easily dismissed anti-feminist sentiment is, but also how Christianity aligns with patriarchy for cultic purposes. It can be debated whether patriarchy and Christianity are the chicken or egg, respectively, but they do aid each other, and that alone is a problem. If Christianity is at its strongest when patriarchal, or vice versa, then it is necessarily anti-equality and promotes harm. But patriarchy is one of many iterations of classism in Christianity. The ranks are not merely based on gender or even finances. Sometimes it's social status, sometimes it's not. Addressing this cuts to the heart of the lies that the Christian cult leaders tell. They will tell you that Christianity teaches ultimate equality, pure love, and the fairest ideologies possible. But it's not true. Christianity, at least in the United States, is capitalistic, and all the problems found in greedy corporate America are in the church. And sure, it might be another question of who is influencing who, but it's undeniable that ranks exist in the Christian system, and those ranks cause harm and negate their claims of finding true love, joy, or equality amongst their cult. And like the rest of all classist systems in history, they are racist and selective in their history. But little did I know that I'd get to interview Mark Charles to make that point. And Mark Charles had a significant influence on me before I even wrote my book. So when I found out I had a connection to him, I shot my shot. And he agreed to come on. And I realized that I could do this. I could interview more than just people I knew. I could ask the tough questions to people with more influence than I. And I could learn through questions during the podcast and not appear small. And I was nervous and knew we weren't ideologically identical, but boy, does he have wisdom to share. And it's still a huge honor that I've gotten to interview him, not just for the podcast, but again for the Click News. And the overall point was that Christians don't even have a common memory with non-believers. The revisionist history is not just about ancient Israel, but 30 to 50 years ago. They deny reality and change the narrative because they refuse to be held accountable for their harm. And that harm is not just slavery or systematic injustices, but literally torture when it comes to Christianity's impact on its adherents' mental health. And I didn't plan on doing an episode on mental health each season, but it felt right the more I did it. But that first one, man, it was as vulnerable as I've ever been publicly. Describing the exact nature of my suicidal tendencies and history of self-harm was something I'd really only spoken to close friends about. So knowing that I was going to permanently publish my pain like this online forever was daunting. Also, I decided to write that episode while I was in a really tough headspace. But it was powerful to show that what Christianity would like to minimize, I refuse to. Christianity made me self-harm, and it made me want to kill myself. And there's nothing anyone can say to negate that fact. Sure, there is more nuance. There are interesting things to talk about. But it is not an oversimplification to blame them for the number they have done on my brain and countless others. And it affects more than mental health. It affects worldview. Hence, Christianity is religiously monogamous. Having Sierra on to discuss this so early, when transparently, I was still highly skeptical of polygamy, just as a concept. But it increased my ability to destigmatize it in my own brain. I already knew Christianity had it wrong. They treated relationships incorrectly by enforcing monogamy, sometimes to levels that I would call grooming. Now, here, I am open to polyamory in my own life, and I'm also completely accepting of everyone who finds it helpful for theirs. And I owe Sierra a great deal for helping to explain so clearly why monogamy as a norm is not only damaging, but built on lies. In fact, so much of Christianity is damaging because it tries to normalize things so universally while ignoring all those taboo subjects behind closed doors. And that's why doing an episode on abuse might seem kind of weird, because all of this shit is abusive. But it's important to be specific, and having Holly on was a way to do that. She suffered a lot as a Christian, and the biggest connection to make is to understand that some of the obvious abuses don't happen out of nowhere. But because within a system that teaches an abusive God as holy, and abusive pastors as loving, and abusive husbands as righteous, abuse is inevitable. It's not abusers sneaking into church. It's church producing abusers. And one of the most common systemic abuses within Christianity is homeschooling. And while I am not of the opinion that homeschooling is inherently abusive or neglectful, the way Christians see it as an opportunity to indoctrinate and isolate creates opportunities to physically, mentally, and socially harm children. And in preparing for that episode, a thought dawned on me I had never considered. Homeschooled children are rarely around mandatory reporters. In other words, their avenues for escaping abuse are so much more limited than other kids. And Chris also is brilliantly well spoken on how the method of education can be beneficial, but the misinformation and disinformation makes it dangerous. In addition to what it already does psychologically to Christian kids who often already feel ostracized, the way Christians practice homeschooling is abusive. And nowhere is their contempt and hatred for the outside world more evident than in their bigotry towards queer people. And having Rachel on, an advocate and expert in LGBT plus hate, and Lily as well, made the conversation dynamic, but also fundamental. The amount of suffering queer people deal with causes high emotions, but it's important to realize so much of history has tried to hide and change queer folks to no avail. Because you cannot stop love and you cannot stop self-expression. The cult of Christianity tries, but they will always fail. Those Christians, man, they like to think that all truth can be found in the New Testament stories of Jesus and his followers, but it can't. I invited Pastor Doug Ward on to try to explain some of my problems with the New Testament as a source, and in retrospect, I'm not sure I'd invite him on again. But I learned a lot by having him on. One, I learned that I can challenge anyone about anything, and I don't have to be shy about it. Two, confronting misinformation in real time is hard. And three, just because someone has written a book doesn't mean they are well informed. And finally, even pastors crumble when faced with critiques that they are a cult, because they are a cult. And deep down, I think they might all know it. He tried to present a narrative that he called theologically coherent about both Christianity and culture at large. But those narratives were just untrue, and I'm happy for anyone to listen and suss out who sounds like they're trying to love the world and who sounds like they're trying to control a section of it. But at that time, I was navigating a resistance to anti-theism. I compared and contrasted those certain theists and atheists who seem almost evangelical in their antagonism. I'm not sure I would do this episode now, as I would not equivocate these two groups and just frame the whole conversation differently. I think anti-theists, though I don't consider myself one, are justified in their anger. I just am against bigotry across the board, even towards Christians. I don't hate Christians, and I certainly don't hate them because they believe in Christianity. I simply hate the Christianity that they believe in. And it's a subtle nuance, but one worth making. But despite all my problems with Christianity, I am still anti-shame and pro-forgiveness. I almost wish I could have saved my episode on shame and forgiveness for later, when I had more insight, but I think I knew deep down, even back then, that shame was a cause of pain, and forgiveness could be a source of peace. But the framework Christianity gave me redefined those words so much for the purpose of a manipulative narrative. The theme that I wanted to highlight is that you can confront your own shame and forgive both yourself and others without coercion. You can be autonomous in your healing. Christianity doesn't have a monopoly on redemption arcs. In fact, they tend to break them. And that's the problem with ministry. It's disingenuous. The episode on ministry was almost the last one of my life. Because the day after I scheduled it to post, I was in a dangerous car accident. And the episode itself is good. I do a thorough job of explaining how ideas of servant leadership are wrong-headed and just used to coerce trust in folks who are untrustworthy. But the thing I remember most isn't the episode itself. It's the reality that hit the side of my van and almost killed me. It's the fact that I realized those could have been my last words in public. And I legitimately had to evaluate what I wanted my legacy to be. If I died tomorrow, would I be proud of what I'm doing? Furthermore, if I met Jesus and the evangelicals were right and I was wrong, would I be ready to take my hell on the chin with a smile on my face? The answer is yes. But the car accident did put the podcast on hold so I could heal both mentally and physically. Yet it inspired me to make sure that every word I spoke on the podcast from then on had weight. To never phone it in, and to push harder against the systems that harm not only me, but all the ones I love. Nowhere is that harm more apparent than in the deconstruction of purity culture. Having the ever so articulate and intelligent Mai Leon was incredible. She explained the problem succinctly and joyfully, and I learned a lot of framing that helped me later on. The shame of sex is hardly even the main problem in purity culture. In general, it's just being ashamed of our bodies, who we are, being ashamed of our desires. It's just teaching that we are not enough and we need to be made better. It's the dangling carrot of Christianity that keeps cult followers in denial of the abuse they endure. The deprivation of pleasure, or even just normal human sexuality development, is all to make the evangelical mind more malleable, and pastors and other Christian cult leaders exploit those insecurities by saying that they do have the source of purification. And ultimately, the Christian is forced to say, you will never be pure, not in this life. You must wait till the afterlife. You will there be burned by God as a consuming fire, and you will either suffer or be purified. Stephen Hawley Martin, a quirky New Age thinker who engages in ideas of near-death experiences and consciousness and other hippy-dippy bullshit, is a man after my own heart. While I should have been more challenging to some of his ideas that he propagated in the episode on the afterlife, I couldn't help myself but listen with a smile because obviously, as he even admitted, we don't know what happens after we die. But presenting ideas of unity or consciousness or reincarnation or a collective journey of oneness, it's just so much less toxic sounding than sheeps and goats. And besides, Christians can't even agree on how you get to the right side of the afterlife. Having John Hagman, a weirdo and heretic, convinced he's a Christian on the show to talk about faith and works was definitely the episode I feel the weirdest about. I read his book and hoped to have a good conversation with a Christian who was willing to come on, but he literally elevated James above the rest of Scripture, so while the conversation was interesting at points, it was a little scattered and confusing. But it did help encourage me to vet future guests a little harder, and know that sometimes a monologue could be more valuable than an interview. But no offense to John. It also did explore how Christianity isn't really clear enough about exactly what faith is and exactly what good deeds are. The orator of the faith can really just take whatever makes the most sense to them in their respective context, which is very relevant when talking about segregation, both inside and outside church. The return of Janae to speak on how separate but equal ideas are not helpful, but also for people of color to have a safe place to practice their faith, white people can't really be there. Until at least there's some conciliation or even acknowledgement that white supremacy has taken a hold of the American church, there's little conversation to be had about being united when it comes to white and black Christians. Which is why it's important to explore how Christianity doesn't really have a community. One of my favorite lesser-known evangelicals, Rachel L. Roberts, came on to talk about what community means to us as humans and how finding it is not the math equations that Christians wish it was. The standard in the cult is to find fellowship among like-minded individuals, and out of that pool of people, find a spouse and start a family. Anything outside of that community, quote unquote, is damaging. And not only is that a cultic framework, but it really doesn't factor in when things go wrong. And that includes things like divorce. A rather normal occurrence is deemed taboo by Christianity's cult leaders. So having a divorce lawyer, Leslie, on and one divorce lawyer who's kind of seen it all, it was super enlightening on how you can view divorce as a fact of life and something that doesn't have to carry shame and stigma. Religions always tend to make divorce harder and even make the process separate from the legal process. It's odd that Christians can essentially reject a secular divorce with no repercussions. And I think this is one of the interviews that was a bit of a checkpoint for my knowledge. I realized that not only does the cult manipulate its own adherents, but it even manipulates our own government and society at large in such a way that they are permitted to keep abusing people under the guise that this is a holy religious community. Essentially, it all comes down to marketing. Thinking of churches as brands or businesses and discussing ad campaigns for megachurches with John Folis was another sharp pierce into the frameworks that I, and I'm sure others, get used to. Instead of viewing these places as charitable communities who try to do good work in society, it's helpful to see how they function more as a business selling a product or service and use rather secular means to achieve their cultic goals. Speaking of marketing, the next episode was a free episode of Parsing Propaganda. and part of the reason I released it for free instead of a regular episode was to entice the listener, that's you, to pay $5 a month to get more content. But also I put a lot of work into that particular one, dissecting a rather dry manifesto by the now deceased, rest in pieces, Tim Keller. This exercise was profitable not just to show that there must be racist or at least ignorant reasons that white Christian cult leaders are against critical race theory, but to prove to myself that these larger-than-life theological figures are all word salad, no meat. I can deconstruct their language and invalidate their points, and even though social status might make them appear smarter or more clever, it's not true. Their arguments are empty. So I guess I can thank my Christian college experience for something. R. Scott Okamoto's podcast, Chapel Probation, was very enlightening for me when I found it, and it's a topic I'm passionate about exposing, and I know Chris is too. The Christian college episode that Scott was on was special, and a favorite on the all-time list for sure. More than that, his own show, where Chris and I were a guest and got to get into the weeds of our collective Bible college experience, was not only therapeutic, but validating, and an opportunity to be brave and vulnerable. And since then, I've investigated 185 Christian colleges, interviewed an incredible survivor of a sexual abuse from Liberty University, who was then further punished once it was found out, and I became very familiar with Title IX laws, the lawsuit that's currently going against the Department of Education. And I've just been able to be an active advocate against the abuse that happens at Christian colleges. It's a giant topic and one that needs to be explored even more, because it is where rubber meets the road when it comes to evangelical domination. American exceptionalism, Christian supremacy, and the cultic ideology in their theology is a blown-up, ugly, monstrous version of narcissism. Radia Gleese, an amazing cult survivor and intelligent analytical author, is a huge, huge inspiration to me. And this was the first of many conversations we would have. And it was so well done. This was also marked a turn in me trying to become an expert in just how Christianity is cultic, but actually become a bit of a more generic cult expert. Without Radia, it would never have happened. Both her book and the documentary she was featured in were life-changing. And rather than completely changing my mind about my observations and changing my framework on how I describe cults, it really just confirmed what I had previously observed in Christianity. And it made me more confident in asserting my thesis that Christianity is a cult and that cults are where leaders control, contain, convert followers. It's wild that I guessed right and coined a framework that holds up to scrutiny. Cult leaders are narcissists and they beget narcissistic thinking. Cults grow by feeling like they are superior. That sort of self-absorption undoubtedly affects people's mental health, and having Lily on to do another mental health episode with me was fun. It was fun and vulnerable, and a great exploration of how traumatic things don't have to define us. We were prepared for the conversation to be heavy, but it was actually more healing than heart-wrenching. In fact, it was a little humorous. Speaking of humor, my episode on humor with Dan Capper was super enlightening. It was fun to joke around with a former preachy guy turned comedian. But something that struck me even more was how he pointed out that the stand-up comedy community has some of the same toxicity as churches do. Those parallels were fascinating to me, and a point I hadn't really considered before. And in short, I think sometimes people need to do emotional work, either in therapy or other safe spaces, but they instead try to turn to shortcuts, like shock humor in comedy or penance in their local parish. But it's not mere emotional shortcuts, even intellectual ones, which is why it was fun to take the long way through the topic of the origin of both the universe and our species with Dr. Fazell Rana. I am such a fan of him as a person and truly appreciate the amount of intellectual honesty and thorough analysis he brings to these tough topics. He knows a lot more science than me, but more importantly, he's an empathetic Christian. And sure, we debated the details and raised the problems with assuming an intelligent being created the world, but we got deep enough that we were able to point out the rampant problem of anti-intellectualism and evangelicalism, and it is encouraging that not all evangelicals are turning their brains off, and there are Christians who value science. It was a great conversation, and it was fun to get to chat with him again more recently. Speaking of intellectualism, having my friend Patrick on to talk about the divides between Protestants and Catholics was super fun. He is so smart and so well-read and a great history buff. So it was fun to talk about how culty evangelicalism is, but also provoke questions of how Catholics can be culty in the completely identical or different way than evangelicals. Further, the Catholic Church is more open-minded than Protestants and a much wider umbrella of beliefs. But it was fun to not only get into the history, but explain the differences of the modern day and highlight how United States culture has impacted the faith to a rather extreme degree. In the same vein, conversion therapy is a practice that grew out of religious thought, but also tough love pseudotherapy of the United States. And Lucas Wilson, a genius and hilarious man who survived very uncomfortable and psychologically damaging conversion therapy at Liberty University, was a fantastic guest who has done fantastic work since and tells his story well. And even though I don't usually just let people tell their stories, and am more doing analysis and topic discussions, I had to have my friend Finn on to tell his story of being kidnapped and tortured by Christians. It's truly just a jaw dropper, and while I know most churches would not do such horrible psychological torture as to literally make young adults feel like they let someone die by not being good enough missionaries, it just shows how bad things can get when cults are allowed to exist unregulated and unchallenged. Abuse is inevitable. But what is inevitable? Said the philosopher. And that was the rather deep philosophical and inceptive topic of my episode on determinism and free will. I talk about the brainwashing and sociopathic encouragement found in Calvinistic systems, but also what that ideology might get right. Because in secular philosophy, you end up with the same problems as you do in theologies of God's omniscience and alleged giving of free will to humans. But are we free? Well, guess what I solved in that episode? Absolutely nothing. But it was still a fun adventure to explore philosophy in light of how Christians can manipulate ideas we don't understand and fully pretend to have the answers. The ultimate lie of Christianity is that you are freer if you are Christian. You are not. The only thing you really achieve here in the United States is another layer of privilege, or as they like to call such an entitlement, religious freedom. And it was rather crazy to do an episode on religious freedom mere days before the Roe v. Wade overturn happened. Sometimes throughout this podcast, I've wanted to shout at the masses, "I told you so!" This was one of those times. Religious freedom means Christian supremacy here, which ended up transitioning well into the beginning of season 3 with Ashadea talking about abortion. That conversation was invaluable and a great session of debunking religious misinformation about what abortion is, why people get them, and how to frame the conversation in a way that respects people's autonomy and doesn't judge what ultimately should be private medical decisions. And so much of the misinformation that Christians indulge is sourced from Scripture. And it's sourced from Scripture that shouldn't even be theirs. So having Rabbi Mike on to explain all the problems that come about when Christians decide to interpret and take ownership of Hebrew Scripture through a Christological and also anti-Semitic lens, it was wonderful. And yeah, I've since learned he has some personal issues, but the episode and his book are still important resources for understanding what Christians get wrong about the Old Testament. Because Christianity poisons everything it touches, whether it is Scripture, that really shouldn't be theirs, or pop psychology. They appeal to religious indoctrination dressed up as Christian counseling. And boy, that episode made me cry. Because it is therapy abuse. It is healthcare abuse. It's honestly mentally one of the worst traumas to experience. To try to get healing and receive more trauma, bad coping skills, and spiritual abuse is about as bad as it gets when you are a Christian. And that episode is powerful not just because of Sierra and I's testimony to the damage of these private moments of religious trauma, but because Lily's breaking down of just how bad this kind of healthcare abuse can be. It made for a powerful, powerful episode. And sometimes it starts young. Having Jacob on to talk about private Christian schools' casual indoctrination dressed up as education was enlightening. Christians want their own schools because that is an effective and daily system where molding minds to be more Christian can be done most effectively, whether those who went there ever even fully realize it. And the dress codes at such schools affect people's body image. But Christianity in general is just obsessed in all the wrong ways with human bodies and careless in all the wrong ways with bodily autonomy. Having Ashley Dunstan on to reframe the conversation, to be not only more respectful, but also just establish how patriarchal and abusive all theologies are regarding our bodies, how it keeps us from loving ourselves and serves the ultimate goal of the cult: control the body, control the mind. That episode was life-changing, and Ashley is brave and compassionate, and we need a lot more of her and folks like her in the world. This is most apparent in how Christians view sex. Erica Smith, Melissa Spires, and Claire Jones were brilliant in describing the ins and outs of both church and cultural taboos that do damage and are anti-sexual health and anti-education. It's a tough topic for me to talk about, and it was awesome to have experts in the field not only take the reins of an important conversation, but educate me and improve my own sex life by talking through some of the traumatic and toxic ideas of sex that primarily come from puritanical Christian beliefs regarding what should ultimately be personal decisions. Even things that are not natural should really be personal decisions. Recreational drugs, especially the unhealthy and addictive ones, are taboo in our culture at large, but stigmatizing them with shame helps nothing. And as Devan and Hubert from the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast so articulately expresses, churches are even worse than the drug dealer community. Think about that. And it's worth pointing out that getting clean is often important for people's health, both physical and mental. But Christians pretending that druggies are the bottom of society is hypocritical at minimum. And it's just abusive in practicality. Pastors are so much more selfish and less Christ-like than drug dealers. And that episode convinced me that it's not hyperbole to say such. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's all stigmatized by the pious Christian. And while I can see how culturally some Christians have been able to generate fear of liberated sex or unrestrained drug use, there is no excuse for the satanic panic and generating fear of secular music. But as Scott, Chris, and I discussed, the fear of the outside is simply and transparently a cult tactic. The world out there is so scary and evil and wants your soul, but here we are, we save people and give them a life worth living. That mindset leads to a systemic issue. One such is Christians adopting children as a form of expressing superiority and rescuing kids from the world out there. Sierra did a great job of not only educating the audience and I about how historically Christians have used adoption as both a form of slavery and just showing off their status as super Christians, but her personal testimony to how adoption by Christians is not automatically wholesome was impactful, to say the least. She also educated me and my audience on how few rights adopted children such as her have, and where things not only can go wrong, but really be completely life-altering. And the ultimate life-altering indoctrination that Christians teach is that death isn't the end, and that to die is gain. Having Callie, one of my best friends, on the pod to talk about death, as she has seen more dead bodies than anyone I know, it was incredible. It was healthy, and it aided me in my many hang-ups about grieving death. Christianity took away a lot of my safety when it comes to exploring and confronting death, as it does for many people. Callie gave me back that power, and I'm forever grateful, not just for that episode, but just for her love and compassion. Death might very well be the end of everything for all of us, whether we lived a Christian life, a moral life, or an immoral one. But does morality even exist? I explored that moral question and others in my episode on morality, and guess what? I once again solved nothing. But it was a helpful monologue exploring the ins and outs of the different viewpoints one can take, but how Christianity does that work for you because it wants you to believe that Christianity is moral, and it's moral to just believe in Christ. That's done to erase your ability to figure out on your own what your morals are, and just merely submit to the cult's authority. And that leads to suffering. And as I discussed with Miley, that suffering is explained away by encouraging it as a badge of honor. You know, only the privileged Christians get to adopt a kid to show off their Christ-likeness. But anyone can suffer like Jesus did. By encouraging suffering, they rebrand pain as pleasure and trauma as trials, all to further allow their abuse to feel like love. That's a lot of what I talked about in my third episode on mental health. Abuse is so normalized that leaving Christianity feels scary, but it's also empowering. But the back and forth of that empowerment and fear can feel so intense and anxiety-inducing that exploring self-reflective questions can be so hard when the scars of evangelicalism remain. And this is very apparent in exploring questions of gender. Having Kit Morgan, my friend, on to talk about the ins and outs of not only gender identity, but how it relates to our self-perception in light of Christian supremacy and the influence of fundamentalism and evangelicalism, it was an experiment in expanding definitions that were taught as evil in the cult. Queer identity in general is such a massive, scary thing if you were told it was the antithesis to holy living. But it's not. It's wonderful to be who you are with no judgment. And buying into the binary paradigm Christians propagate is not about living healthily, but just being more rigid in your self-identity so they can manipulate the masses more easily. All of these things are important to discuss because the only stopping religious trauma regarding queer identity or anything else is accomplished through journalism. Or at least that's the argument that I built during the Global Center for Religious Studies conference that I spoke at. It was a fun discussion and a bit of peeling back the curtain on why I do the work I do. We have to do more than just ask survivors to keep re-triggering themselves, talking about their trauma, and address the source of such trauma. We have to infiltrate these cults of Christianity and talk about what they are doing. Let the secrets be public, and then we can see the world change. And it's not just evangelicals that need to be exposed. Progressive Christianity has a lot of problems too. I know this not only from my journalistic investigations, but also just by analyzing the theology of progressive Christians. It sounds nicer. And if you're going to be a Christian, please be a progressive one. But the appeals to authority are sometimes even more rampant, and the freedom to be open-minded is actually nil if you don't fully articulate why it is important to be a Christian. I will say the only bright side to progressive Christianity is our churches do tend to be more diverse. And diversity in general is not encouraged in most Christian environments because they need uniformity in ideology. The more races, the more orientations, more genders you add to a room, the harder it is to synthesize ideas into sound bites. The more digestible the theology is to a uniform audience, the easier it is to control, contain, and convert. So having Scott back to share his insights on that episode only reaffirmed that non-white, non-male voices are othered in order to keep a monolith of power. And all of this is the antithesis of love. I explored the idea of love extensively at the end of season 3, and that episode was not one of the most popular, but it's one of the most important to me. I talked about how love is not obedience, which was my primary confusion in Christianity. But my poetic descriptions of love as air and my thorough word studies and ramblings about empathy are not what make that episode important to me. The significance of the episode is at the end, I said something out loud I never had before. I said these words: I love myself. It wasn't true before I said it, at least not in the absolute sense, but it has been true ever since. And I'm so proud of myself for being brave and taking the step to say it out loud. And it changed my life forever. Yay me. Between seasons 3 and 4, I released some bonus episodes about once a month. I talked about Shiny Happy People, the documentary, and how it was an excellent expose on the IBLP cult and how such an authoritarian sect developed out of the cult of Christianity. I talked about the Supreme Court, and how the cult of Christianity has infiltrated the highest court in our country in an effort to make this a Christian nationalist state. I spoke about Netflix's How to Become a Cult Leader, having Radia back on to talk about how the documentary confused education with entertainment in a rather egregious way, but still summarized some of the most infamous cults in a way that shows there is a growing interest in coercive control in group settings. I did another episode of Parsing Propaganda showing how the conservative influencer, The Transformed Wife, is anti-women. I talked about the Israel-Palestine conflict and how holy wars really shouldn't be related to Christianity, but are thoroughly entrenched in Christian Zionist ideals and rhetoric. And I also ranted about how Christmas is a celebration I despise and find that celebrating the mythology of a virgin birth is not only weird, but symbolically shows how cultic Christian holidays are. And the final season of the Cult of Christianity began with a bang. Daniela Young came on, and she is my favorite cult expert. So it was really the climax of so much of what I've been building with this show. She does a comparative analysis between cults and the military, kind of like how I do with Christianity and other cults. And me and her are just kindred spirits, and I'm honored to find both safety and education in our conversations off air and on. The military is a normalized institution touted as heroes, but they do great harm, not just to their enemies, but to their own. And that is identical to Christianity. Further, how Christians revere the military shows that there is bloodlust and martyrdom complexes in their ideology and approach to life. So much so that even how Christians approach science is flawed. Having Dr. Fazal Rana back was good, and while I find his scientific inquiry valid and insightful, I also was able to get to the heart of our disagreement about science. And the heart of which is, at the end of the day, Christianity's faith commitment is larger than their commitment to evidence, reason, and trust can be. At the end of the day, Christians are bound to believe their God is bigger than science. And because of that, the rest of reality is hard to even share with Christians. That's one of the many reasons why Christian narratives around homelessness are just completely alternative to the truth. Christians are not only prejudiced against homeless folk, but as SJR, who now goes by Frankie, and I discussed, the Christians are worse off than many people who have hit rock bottom. And this is maybe my favorite episode of all time, and I've never connected with a guest so quickly, and it was wonderful to be both lighthearted and talk about heavy trauma in a space where we could dig into how dive bars are better churches, churches have locks and do jack shit for the homeless, and how the drugs that many homeless folks indulge are actually necessary evils in coping with how fucked up the capitalist world is. If Christians wanted to prove that they were love and light in the world, they would actually help people who experienced what we did without expecting a conversion. And the lack of ability to care for the homeless, combined with Christianity's intense proclivity to engage in conspiracies, shows that Christians live in a different planet, at least in their mind. Sinead Shea did a great job summarizing the current QAnon and outlandish internet conspiracies that grew in white evangelical circles, especially around COVID. And further, it was enlightening to realize that the whole belief system does believe in a divine conspiracy to seek and save the lost. The neuropaths in Christianity are to imagine narratives more than observe tangible facts, and it affects their abilities to be taken seriously as academics. As Darren Slade and I discussed, the prejudice of Christians doesn't mean they can't make compelling arguments or talk about philosophy, but that faith commitment just ends up being loyalty to a cult over truth. In fact, it makes them loyal to the cult even over their own friendships. As Chris and I candidly discussed, our friendship, as strong as it was when we were both Christians, became deeper, more honest, and healthier after we both left the cult. When the thing that unites you is a consensual bond, not of mere loyalty, but love, it enriches your life more than being commanded to love your own ilk. Christianity does not foster healthy friendships, it hinders them. The hatred of outsiders demonstrates that conformity is more important than community. And it's part of why they hate other religions and cultures so much, as my friend Jamal and I discussed. Islamophobia is a combination of ignorant racism mixed with xenophobia and just old grudges. The hate is outdated, it's anti-progress, and it shows that believing in God is not enough. You must conform to Christianity's specific beliefs, and that's why they'll send missionaries anywhere. As Shannon Newson and I said in our episode on missionary work, she talked about covert tactics to infiltrate the Jewish community in Israel to convert Jews and tell them how to read their own scriptures. There is no country, no culture, no creed that is safe from their manipulative message. They are on a mission. But so am I. And Lily came back for the final installment of the only repeat topic, mental health. It's important that people's mental health not only be taken seriously and that disorders are destigmatized and traumas are validated as harmful. It's important to take ownership of your mental health and not be fatalistic. Even as this has been a hard year for Lily, and now, after recording, I was doing pretty well, but now it's kind of turned into a somewhat hard year for me. Our traumas and triggers don't get to run the show. The mis and disinformation we were fed no longer rules our life. And we get to define our lives now, not ancient scribbles from thousands of years ago. And the Bible, it's a large topic, But I gave you the gist in 90 minutes. That episode is some of my proudest and hardest work, because giving the narrative content, trying to make thousands of years of history make sense, and speaking to where this undue reverence for these texts comes from, it's not easy. But the biggest takeaway from all the hard work I put into that episode is that the Bible doesn't have to mean anything to you. But it is useful to have some knowledge in refuting the Christian nationalists who wield its presumptive authority rather wildly. Though there has always been an exceptionalism and narcissism attached to Christianity, nationalism is not divinely ordered and only causes destruction, as history has proven repeatedly. The Christians have all sorts of apologetic strategies to normalize their violence and fantasy, but in peeking behind the curtain of their defenses of faith, you find something less substantive than the Wizard of Oz. Apologetics is bullshit, and it's all manipulation. But they are masters of manipulation. They're masters of hypnotizing and thought-stopping language. It's all nuanced and messy and layered, but understanding that language is a universal form of communication, not a mere means of gospel preaching, is essential in moving past their ultimately empty words. It's also important in moving past their ultimately empty threat. Hell, a concept so unbiblical and inconsistent with their message and downright sadistic, has taken center stage in their theology. It's beyond a red flag. It's a bloodied battle for them to fight for their belief in eternal punishment. They fought for hideous theologies of hell, but also nonsensical ones. The Trinity has never made any sense. 3 has never equaled 1. But they insist on seeing just how far they can push people to believe nonsensical things, to test the boundaries of how much critical thinking they can suppress, and absolute domination they can have over one's heart, soul, and mind. But the Christians do not own spirituality. They never have, they never will. Hell, most of them don't even understand what spirituality is. They simply bludgeon people with totalitarian ideology, high control religion, us versus theming indoctrination, and tell others to convert the masses to their worthless MLM. They can rant about the end times, the last days, the fears we should all have of an eternal judgment, but we are smarter than that. We know there are better ways to live your life than in fear of a hypothetical next one. Their message is losing power. We just have to resist the fear, the manipulation, the control, the lies, and their authoritative posturing. They will lose. The failure of the cult of Christianity is not a failure to be Christian enough. It's a failure to step back and deconstruct the whole system. I'm not ending this podcast because the debate has been settled, but because the conversations need to be louder, and I have said my piece. You all have heard me. Now, go forth and live your life free of any cult that wishes to control, contain, or convert you. Don't be a follower. Don't be a leader. Be your own person. Along the journey of this podcast, our definitions got more refined. We deconstructed and reconstructed ideas, words, and topics. We met some amazing people and learned some hard lessons. We challenged and were challenged. We were strong and vulnerable. We experimented in taboo subjects and pushed conversations past their normal cycles of comfortability. We were brave. We were kind. We kept love in our life. We settled for nothing and gained, maybe, everything. We pursued freedom. And I think we found it. At the very least, Through our casual conversations, intense disagreements, formal and informal research, hard-hitting questions, testimonies of trauma and triumph, and our honest assessment of the cult of Christianity. It was helpful, maybe even inspiring, but at the very least, somewhat entertaining. This is the final season of the Cult of Christianity, but this is not the last time I will be investigating religions and cults. If you'd like to continue to follow my work, go to jverner.com or follow my Substack at johnverner.substack.com. You can also continue to support my work by going to thecultofchristianity.com and subscribing for a giant backlog of bonus content and stay up to date when my next big project releases. Thank you for listening, subscribing, sharing, reviewing, and as always, keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.